they're healthier because of what they don't eat or don't eat so much of. I think of the Mediterranean diet as a midpoint between a really bad Western diet and a really good diet. You can get a lot better than the Mediterranean diet, but if most Americans just switch to a Mediterranean diet, a lot of their metabolic disorders would improve, including their brain. Because with a Western diet, you may be getting something where 30 to 70 grams of saturated fat a day. And with the Mediterranean diet, more like 10 to 20. So that's a lot closer to the guidelines than American diet.
So, Ray, how do we prevent getting Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease? And then also, I'm going to throw in again, heart disease and strokes. What are the most important things we can do to prevent them?
Well, I think it varies. So Alzheimer's disease, I think the biggest environmental risk factor is probably air pollution. So air pollution, when you see smog, you see little pieces of dirt and soot. And those pieces of dirt and soot, most of them we cough out or sneeze out, but some are so small, they're like 1/70th the width of your hair, and they go into your nerve responsible for smell. And hitchhiking on those little pieces of dirt and soot are toxic metals, lead from leaded gasoline, iron from brakes, platinum from catalytic converters, and they can cause misfolding of a protein that's implicated in Alzheimer's disease and to a lesser extent in Parkinson's. And so we know for both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, loss of smell is one of the earliest features of the disease. It begins years, if not decades, before memory loss and impaired movement occur. And we know for both diseases that pathology likely begins in the smell center of the brain, which is just above the nerve responsible for smell, and then spreads to the memory centers for Alzheimer's disease and to the movement centers for Parkinson's disease. So I think air pollution is a huge issue. Just one vignette on that. This woman who was a child prodigy in Mexico, went to medical school at age 16. Her name is Dr. Lilian Calderon Garcia-Duenas. And she was concerned about the air pollution in Mexico City, which in the early 90s was the most polluted city in the world. And she looked at the brains of 203 people who died early from either car accidents or gun violence, and looked at their brains. So 203 people ages 11 months old to 40. And she found Alzheimer's pathology in 202 of the 203 brains. And she found Parkinson's pathology in 20% of the brains. And these people obviously didn't have the symptoms of Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, but they had the early pathological features of this disease from that. So you raise your eyebrows. I'll give you one more. She wasn't content with that. She then looked at dogs in Mexico City and compared their brains to the dogs from a clean air part of Mexico, and found Alzheimer's pathology in the dogs in Mexico City, but not the dogs in the clean air part of Mexico.
And are there any places in the United States that are polluted, obviously not to the extent of Mexico City, but that are polluted enough that we're going to expect, particularly high levels of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease in those areas?
Yeah, so if you look at the map of particulate matter, these tiny pieces of air pollution, you look at the map of Parkinson's disease, while Steve and Evan talk, I'll see if I can pull it up. You see a striking correlation. I'll pull that up in a second. They looked at, researchers at USC looked at women in their 70s in LA and who didn't have any cognitive impairment at baseline, looked at them over 10 years. Women who lived in more polluted parts of Southern California had greater rates of cognitive decline than women who lived in less polluted areas.
Okay, so now you talk about air pollution, which and I've sat through your talk, and obviously it's I think you also go over. You've spoken about Dr. James Parkinson. That was you, correct, Ray?
Yeah.
Okay. I've done like 80 or 90 of these, so but I got to keep track of who says what. So, and how it was the advent of the Industrial Revolution. So clearly, pollution plays a huge role. Why do they call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes now? Is that accurate? What's the role of diet in your opinion? And then I want to get the opinion of the other doctors.
I don't call it type 3 diabetes. I'm going to let Dr. Allen. My guess is he and Dr. Blake have better thoughts on it. We do know that diabetes is not good for the brain. High glucose levels is not good for the brain, but I suspect that Drs. Allen and Blake are going to have more to say.
Okay. I'll give it
Yeah,
to
I
you.
would not call it type 3 diabetes either. One of the problems with high saturated fat diets is that it induces insulin resistance. And I recently wrote a paper on this. And this insulin resistance happens in the brain as well. What do brain cells need to function? Glucose. Why can't you get that glucose into the brain cells? Well, first of all, the clogged arteries from the saturated fat. And second of all, the insulin resistance from the saturated fat. The obvious solution is to drink a bunch of coconut oil so that you get more clogged arteries and you can get some ketones to fire up those poor dying brain cells. No, I'm being facetious. I don't think that's a very good idea.
All right.
Yeah, and to be clear, the amount of medium chain triglycerides in unprocessed regular coconut oil or whatever you're going to get is less than 15% of the total calories in that. If you want to use actual MCTs, then those are a very different ball game and may not have the negative effects of coconut oil by itself. I wouldn't recommend drowning your food in MCTs, but they don't metabolize the same way. They're all 10 carbon or less. I think actually 12 carbon or less. So they're not going to be as negative. But another factor that leads people to think that Alzheimer's and senile dementia and vascular dementia, which are, in my opinion, many heads of the same hydra, are related to diabetes is because the insulin resistance is partially mediated by ceramide. And ceramide is raised by dietary saturated fat, and ceramide is neurotoxic. And so these people will have high insulin resistance indices when we measure them. They will have, pre-diabetic or, metabolic associated fatty liver physiology, even if they may not have frank diabetes. But we have gotten this idea that type 2 diabetes is a disease of carbohydrate excess. All the evidence is against that when looked at in broad scope. There's no question that type 2 diabetes is a disease that is made worse by high consumption of simple sugars once it exists, because that's a trigger to raise blood sugar even further. But its primary cause is not carbohydrate consumption by itself. And we have human history to look at for that. We have almost no type 2 diabetes in the Irish in the 1830s before the potato famine, when they ate 4,000 calories of white potatoes a day per person. There's essentially no diabetes, and this is documented. China didn't develop a diabetes epidemic until after the rice consumption dropped. 80% of their calories in 1980 were from white rice, very, very low rates of diabetes. So this simplistic association between carbohydrate consumption and diabetes, because diabetes manifests as high blood sugar, is misunderstanding the problem, and it's a society-wide issue. If we have a society where all the drains are plugged and our solution is to always turn off faucets and never run water, all we're doing is saying, oh, well, we just, it's a water problem. So we're never going to address the actual issue, which is all our drains are plugged. And we just have to trickle in water to make sure the drains can handle it. What we need to do is unplug the drains. And in diabetes, the carbohydrate is the water, but it's not the problem. The problem is the insulin resistance, which is driven by high animal protein, high saturated fat diets that have numerous negative health effects.
So turning this back.
So agree with you there, Evan Allen. That's really good. And by the way, the insulin resistance exhibits another way. The insulin resistance in the liver stops the liver from seeing the excess blood sugar. And so the liver continues to make blood sugar continuously, keeping blood sugar high. So that just supports what you just said.
So going back to what I had asked Ray, how do we prevent Alzheimer's and Parkinson's as well as heart disease and stroke? And I'll give that to you, Evan.
From my point of view, the way to prevent it is to start in childhood. We know that all of these diseases start in childhood. And listening to Ray, I'm feeling kind of not great about my Southern California childhood in the 1970s, when we had days where we couldn't go to school because the smog and air quality were so bad. I moved to Loma Linda, California in 1971 in July. And most people probably haven't been there, but it's surrounded by the San Bernardino Mountains, which are absolutely gorgeous snow-capped mountains that are phenomenal to see. But I didn't know they existed until December, because the air quality was so atrocious that it took a thunder shower in December to actually let me know they were there. And, we didn't have kids who didn't have asthma back then. All of us would go out and play, and then we would play for about 30 minutes, and then we'd go inside and wheeze until it went away, and then we would go back out. So these diseases start in childhood. Any approach that waits until adulthood is waiting too long. We need to get parents to understand that vascular disease, brain disease, cancer risk, all this starts in childhood. And it's why we need to use observational science in addition to the other tools science has to understand things. We have become so RCT centric in the age of pharmaceuticals that we fail to understand that RCTs can't give us the whole picture. Astronomers can't do a randomized controlled trial on various stars. But because they can't do that doesn't mean we know nothing about astronomy. We can know oodles about astronomy from observation alone. And when we talk about diseases that take decades to manifest, we can't look at them through a randomized controlled trial lens. It's impossible to do. We have to look at the totality of the picture, including what's happened in human history. And human history can rule out explanations that could not possibly be true.
Okay. And
Can I comment on what?
are you raising your hand?
Yeah, I raised my hand.
You're being way too polite. You can just.
I gave it applause and a thing.
Okay. I'm like, what's going on there? Yeah, you can just jump in.
So this is I'm going to make Evan feel a little bit worse. I agree with Evan's point. I think early childhood exposure might be more disabling, more concerning for these things than late adult exposure. So can you see my screen? This map?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
So this is a map of new cases of Parkinson's disease. Bear in mind people have moved and stuff like that, but we'll just take this as a snapshot. So this shows basically that there are some clear areas of the country that have high rates of Parkinson's disease. The upper Midwest, Southern California, the San Fernando Valley, where lots of pesticides are. And then
my cohort.
And then this is the map of particulate matter, these tiny pieces of particulate matter. And so, the maps look concerning, at least to my eyes, and this probably isn't the right amount of lag. And, there's a lot of noise in this, but I think it's concerning. And to Evan's point, just to give you how bad air pollution was, the governor of California in the 1960s and early 1970s said that we should ban all unnecessary driving because of how bad the air pollution was. Evan, you need to remember who that governor was?
That was Ronald Reagan.
That was Ronald Reagan, who was also turned out to be the first president, as far as we know, to develop dementia. And, where was he spending a large portion of his life was in Southern California.
Wow.
So I think there's something here. Now, I can't say whether Ronald Reagan's thing was due to air pollution, but I would be concerned. And these diseases like Parkinson's disease, when Dr. James Parkinson described Parkinson's disease, he says, I'm describing something new, something that's not been described in the medical literature. He's described 6 people with the disease. He's 61 years old, been practicing medicine or surgery for 30 some years. His father was also in medicine. So he's saying I'm describing something new, not describing medical literature. 200 years after he described 6 people with the disease, the Global Burden of Disease Study estimates that there's 6 million people with Parkinson's disease worldwide. How do you go from 6 to 6 million? You can't do it with genetics. You really can't explain it by increasing longevity. It has to be environmental factors. And I think air pollution, which was horrific in London in 1800, as bad as it is in Delhi, now worse than it was even in Los Angeles when Evan was growing up and getting asthma, was worse. And then synthetic pests, certain pesticides, I should just say, and this dry cleaning chemical trichloroethylene.
Ray, is there anything you can say to make Evan feel better? Is there any way to detox once you've been exposed?
So I would so I'll tell you what, I bought my parents air filters for Christmas, and they both live in Southern California. So I would use an air filter in Southern California. He's got his air filter in Southern California. And so you can put that in the areas where you spend most of your time, like your bedroom and your kitchen. If you're driving through polluted traffic area, roll up your window, turn your air conditioning, that little button that says circulate the air, you can do that. Evan was saying, people in LA used to wear masks, not because of COVID, but because of how bad the air pollution was. The good news is that air quality in Southern California is vastly better than it was in 1970 when Evan was doing it. And, there was a big windstorm recently, like 3 months ago. And my mom, who lives in Orange County, she could actually see the mountains with the snow cap things. And if anyone's seen the pictures of, India pre and post after the COVID lockdown, how quickly air pollution can be improved. In Paris, they have one day where you don't drive the cars and levels of some air pollutants drop by 40% in like the span of days. So this is a very, very, very tractable thing that we as a society can change in a really, really short period of time with relatively low tech interventions. And we can all breathe cleaner air. And air pollution costs each human in the world on average 3 years of life expectancy. If we didn't have air pollution, every human on average would live 3 years longer. There'd be a lot less asthma. There'd be a lot less heart disease. There'd be a lot less stroke. There'd be a lot less cancer. Be likely a whole lot less Alzheimer's disease and likely less Parkinson's disease.
Now, Ray, I've even seen links to PM 2.5 counts and type 2 diabetes. Yeah, so it's causing metabolic havoc across the board.
It is on the line, according to global burden of disease, it's on the line with a high glycemic index in terms of its disability.
Of course, when you're looking at a highly industrialized area, you're looking at highly industrialized food too. And so in cities, people are more likely to eat that highly processed food, rich in both carbohydrates and saturated fats. And I do still see that. I know I've looked at the research on air pollution and Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's, and it's very good. And I see a connection. I'm still thinking, perhaps because of my bias, but because of the plethora of studies, that food is very, very important too. For instance, brain cells die from oxidation, often caused by inflammation. And we don't support our antioxidant functions effectively enough. Antioxidants can come from foods like vitamin C and vitamin E and carotenoids and polyphenols, and these are crucial, and these are lacking in modern diets. And to make a diet that's going to reduce the incidence of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, we should eat a diet rich in these natural antioxidants. Also, our antioxidant enzymes in our bodies designed to protect us, such as superoxide dismutase, which needs copper, zinc, and manganese in order to function. These are not always available to people through their diets. And selenium, for a superoxide dismutase, one of our most powerful antioxidant enzymes, people are often low in selenium, sometimes high. The idea is to get the right amount of both the antioxidant foods and the antioxidant support minerals so that we can protect our brains. This is one way to protect against this air pollution and the food pollution that we're seeing all around us.
So, Ray, what I was trying to ask you was, is there a way to, once you've been exposed to this air pollution, not how to prevent it from getting into you, how to get it out of you? Is there a way to detox whatever these chemicals are that are later in life going to cause Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, so not that we know of. So we know that people with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease have higher levels of heavy metals in their brain, for example, iron. And I think iron might get in there, don't know, but iron might be getting in there through air pollution. There was a study recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine in which they gave an iron chelating therapy, a pill, to treat people with Parkinson's disease. It got iron out of the brain. Unfortunately, it made people's Parkinson's disease worse, and it caused side effects. So people got worse who took the drug. And it wasn't just placebo; it was worsening. I think it's really, really important to think about ways to prevent people from getting worse. It turns out that people with Parkinson's disease who are exposed to high levels of air pollution have higher rates of hospitalization. It's the analogy, like when you get diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing the doctor tells you to do? Stop smoking. So why don't we stop exposing people to air pollution? Why don't we stop exposing people to pesticides? Why don't we stop exposing people to contaminated water? Why don't we start exposing people to healthier diets? I think there are
First rule of holes.
I'm sorry.
First rule of holes. Stop digging.
Yeah. And we're not doing that. We're actually just fueling the rise of these diseases. We're doing exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. And if you look at smoking, when you smoke your last cigarette, your carbon monoxide levels drop in your blood in seconds. Weeks or months after you stop smoking, your rate of heart attack drops by like 50%. Years after you stop smoking, your rate of lung cancer and cancers drop precipitously. We know that from lung cancer and smoking what the benefits are from stopping ongoing exposure to these things. I think we should be applying those same analogies to thinking about brain diseases.